Welcome to the South Australian Drought Hub podcast, strengthening drought resilience for our farmers and regional communities.
A key to removing herbicide residue in the months before sowing is rain. However, when things are desperately dry, are there other options? G'day, I'm Drew Radford, and this is a question agronomist Chris Davey deals with a lot. To delve into the issue, he joins me for this SA Drought Hub podcast. Chris, thanks for your time.
No worries at all, Drew. Pleasure to be here.
Chris, you wear a couple of hats, Next Level Agronomy and also WeedSmart. For those unfamiliar with either, can you just give me a quick brushstroke of what they are?
Next Level Agronomy, I advise growers, particularly Northern Yorke Peninsula, but that area is expanding to maximise their crop yields and be profitable. Whereas with WeedSmart, I'm an extension officer throughout South Australia and Victoria, which is GRDC funded as well as a lot of other partners, but just promoting really positive and good messages about weed management and trying to prolong the onset of weed resistance.
Key phrase in there is prolong the onset, i.e., I guess ensuring sustainable herbicide use on farms?
Yeah, absolutely correct. There's lots of practices and it doesn't all revolve around herbicides, Drew. So a lot of that WeedSmart role is farming systems. So it can be rotational, it can be crop competition, it can be things we can do at harvest on the header to actually deal with whatever weed seeds are left in the paddock. It's big picture stuff just so that we're reducing the weed seeds burden that is going back into the seed bank from year to year.
We're going to drill down into some of the herbicide stuff in a moment in a bit more detail, but I think a bit of context before we get there. Given your roles across the state, what do you reckon the biggest challenges you saw farmers encounter in terms of crop establishment last year, i.e. 2024?
It's a valid question because we're facing in some ways very similar circumstances with soil moisture going into the 2025 season. So last year, Drew, there were some crop growing regions that had some decent subsoil moisture, but that's actually occurred in November, December in 2023. So after those rains, there was very, very little that we received. And so fast forward to April last year and we were facing dry seeding conditions and there was a lot of questions from farmers as to do they actually go seeding. There was no rain on the forecast. And also what were some of the modifications they had to make to successfully get their crop up. So we're facing that again going into 2025. The main difference being that this year we've got a complete lack of subsoil moisture due to the dry extended period that we've had probably from about August last year.
Is there a difference there too then in terms of the herbicide that was on the ground last year versus this year because it's been so dry for so long?
If we talk last year's herbicides, a lot of herbicides in general have a thing called a plant back period. And so that's the period of time which needs to be elapsed from the application of herbicide through to when a susceptible crop can be planted again. So in a lot of cases that time has elapsed, but the plant back periods also have a rainfall requirement. In a lot of the growing region in SA, we haven't ticked that particular box for a lot of the chemicals. So there's quite a different mindset, I'll call it, to dealing with the residues from last year versus what we're about to do with our pre-emergent herbicides for this coming season. And in some way, they're actually entwined because if your crop is facing a residue from last year, you don't want to be putting out a herbicide for this coming year that is going to add to the problem.
That's quite a consideration, isn't it?
It is. It's, I don't want to go into too much science or detail, but it's not as simple as going, I applied this chemical on this particular date and add up all the rainfall from that particular time, because to break those residual herbicides down, the soil needs to be not only warm, so you're probably talking September onwards, so going into spring as the days are warming up, but it also needs to have an extended period of soil moisture. So little rainfall events, a bit like we've just had here at Wallaroo. We got 2 mils on one day and 1.5 mils on another. Those rains are just not big enough to wet the soil for an extended period. So what we faced last year through August, a little bit of September, and a lot of the other periods when the soil was warm was just these little rainfall amounts, and they're the ones we can't actually or shouldn't be including in our rainfall requirements because they just didn't wet the soil enough.
Okay, well that begs the question then, Chris, if herbicide residues are present, how do farmers go about identifying this? What do they need to be looking for?
I guess there's a couple of different ways. There is actually testing services that can be utilised, but they're generally quite expensive and take a bit of time to actually get a result back. So what I guess the ag industry is recommending or encouraging growers to be looking at is if they're lucky enough to get 10 mils or more and actually get a few weeds up, have a look at some of the symptoms on these weeds or the volunteers of crop from last year that have come up as well. Look for any signs of chemical effect on those weeds and volunteers that are coming up, and that'll give you a bit of an idea that something is still hanging around. The other better way to do it, Drew, is to actually section off maybe a 1 metre by 1 metre area in a paddock, physically plant some seeds with your fingers or something like that into the ground and then wet up that little area of soil. So it might be applying 20 litres or 40 litres to an area, enough to simulate a rain and therefore get those seeds up that you've actually planted in the ground. And then you can actually start having a look as to any effects that those plants that establish actually have. So it's a bit like doing a case study, but doing a fake rain and getting a fake crop up as such, just to see if it's going to be affected by anything.
And what are the visual signs they're looking for then, Chris, in terms of that little test square?
Yeah, there's quite a range, and it depends on what chemical or residual chemical that you're actually looking at, because some of them prune the roots, for instance, and that's very, very hard to determine an effect. But what the crop can actually show, or weeds above ground, is because of the lack of roots, they can show nutrient deficiencies or some leaf tipping, for instance, which just indicates that they're not getting those nutrients up into the leaves where it's needed. Whereas other ones which have maybe a bleaching crop effect, you'll see quite distinct yellowing or whitening of the crop and the weeds above ground. There's others as well that might be a purpling or a stunting or even a twisting or distortion. So I guess you're just looking at a crop effect or symptoms which are not indicative of a healthy plant.
That could be a fairly expensive mistake.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, it would have been done many times over the years, generally by mistake. And sometimes it's even hidden, Drew. Like there could be something in a paddock which, unbeknown to the agronomist or the farmer, may be taking 5, 10, 15% off the yield, but we don't know about it because the crop actually looks relatively healthy. It's only when you've got maybe an untreated area or similar that you can compare it to that you actually go, oh, wow, that area is a lot better than the rest of the paddock. Sometimes it's not visual, it can go undetected.
Perhaps the question I should have asked earlier then, you're effectively talking of cleansing the land by rain, a bit of a crude description, but how much rain is needed to do so, Chris?
And again, Drew, it gets back to the individual chemical and looking at the label and the proposed or planned crop that you wish to grow in that paddock. As a bit of a generalisation, we're looking at 250 mils of rain for probably the vast majority of chemicals, but there are some that are under that and may only require 100 mils. And then there's some that might require double or triple that amount, which would be completely out of the question. When we have a look, I guess, at South Australia, I sort of draw a bit of a line in the sand 1st of August last year. And why I've done that is most of the post-emergent spraying of our crops, if you were lucky enough to put a post-em out, because I acknowledge that there was a lot of drought-stricken area as early as the 1st of August last year. But in those areas that did put a post-em out, it was generally done by then. And for SA, a lot of our cropping regions have only received about 80 to 120 mils, so around that 100 mils of rain since the 1st of August. So we're nowhere near that 250 that we'd like to be.
I'm really glad I asked that question because I was sensing that, but I didn't realise the shortfall was that significant.
Yeah, in some of my presentations to local farmer groups and things, Drew, I've just mentioned, and it's probably quite a common phrase in the ag industry at the moment, is that we're in uncharted waters. And when we say that, there just hasn't been a season in recent memory that we've been this short on the rainfall required to break down or metabolize and get rid of a lot of those chemical residues. I guess in the last 10 years or so, it's probably been a bit more of an issue with some of these newer molecules, newer chemistries that are being introduced into the agricultural landscape, is that they do have these plant-back periods that require rainfall in a time frame. So it's a combination of some newer chemistries as well as just a very, very dry periods in the lead up to the 25 seeding.
Chris, in the absence of rain, what strategies could farmers use if they suspect herbicide residue? What can they do at seeding time to minimise the risks of crop damage?
The easiest way to do it, and it's probably the one that farmers really don't want to do as such because a lot of the farm planning is already done. The rotation is pretty well set and each crop is going in each paddock, but there are crop types, Drew, that are completely tolerant of certain residual chemicals. So the easiest thing to do is actually to change the rotation from the planned crop, if it was going to be sensitive to those chemicals, to one that actually tolerates them. So it can mean a lot more discussion, thinking, understanding of what's happening, but swapping crop types and even varieties of certain crops. So something like an IMI residue, which is a group of chemicals that's commonly used, has an extended period on conventional crops. But if we put an IMI tolerant crop in, then we can overcome that particular hurdle straight away. That's the obvious one, but it's also the hardest because it might involve farmers getting different seed, and it's very hard to do at this time of year, or just modifying and changing the rotation, which is something you're trying not to do this close. Outside of that, there are other things that we can do, and that might be ensuring adequate or good nutrition. I mentioned before about the root pruning ability of some of the herbicides by supplying the crop with good nutrition, whether that be phosphorus, zinc, definitely nitrogen. You can actually have a more resilient crop which can tolerate and metabolize those chemical residues better. We could also change the seeding order. So if there's paddocks that are what I call a red flag, so that is at quite a high risk of the residues, they can be placed at the bottom of the seeding order, and hopefully in that time we've got a bit of decent rainfall and it might just help out break those chemical residues down to a lower level that might be in the soil. There's a few other simpler things like sowing a touch deeper perhaps to get this year's seed away from last year's chemical. Sowing on row, and that's particularly a good one if it's a pre-emergent herbicide from last year because it would still be predominantly in the inter-row. So if we're sowing on last year's row, then we're giving ourselves a bit of space or distance between the chemical and this year's seed. A really important one, Drew, I think also is just to slow down, because when we are sowing at any particular speed, we're throwing soil, and with that soil there is herbicide with it. So by slowing down, we're actually not throwing that soil as far and into neighbouring rows. You just don't want to throw that chemical into the next row of crop. And that's particularly important because there are a lot of paddocks throughout SA which have either had a failed crop in them due to the drought or have been overgrazed simply by just having sheep on them for too long and there's not much stubble there. So we've got to be aware of those bare paddocks that we're seeding into, because again, when the tine or the disc goes through, there's a lot more soil throw in the bare paddocks than if we had stubble present in them. And the final one is either removing the plan of a pre-emergent for this year's crop or changing it to something softer. as we touched on, if your crop for the 2025 season is having to deal with last year's chem residues, the last thing you want to do is load it up with another chemical that it has to deal with for this coming year. Probably 5 or 6 or 7 little tips there. I call them the 1%ers, Drew, and if we can do as many of those 1%ers, well, they could add up to 20%, 30% healthier crop.
What's your final piece of advice for farmers concerned about going into what could be another potentially dry season?
There's a change in priority, I think, as we get closer and closer to the seeding program for 25. And I acknowledge that there are people up in the upper north, upper EP, Riverland that are already into their seeding program. So when I say that, a lot of the emphasis normally is on weed control and things like that. But the priority has actually changed to establishing the healthiest or strongest crop that we can. And I think that's probably a key message, that the two take-home words there, establish and also healthiest or strongest. So the focus has gone away from the weed management and that to maybe using softer chemicals or changing the crop to tolerate residues or some of those other little 1%ers. The key at the moment is to get that crop up and make it as healthy and as strong as what it can. So that's probably the biggest change, has been away from the talk about herbicides and things to actually just how good the crop can be and how strong it can be, because things like the nutrition and changing or removing the pre-em and a few things like that are just going to mean that the crop is just able to be more resilient and tolerant of not only the dry conditions, but the chemical residues and a few things like that. So a real change in mindsets as we get close to the 25 seeding.
Chris, I think that's a really important perspective to finish with. For now though, Chris Davey, agronomist with Next Level Agronomy and also Extension Officer with WeedSmart, thank you so much for joining me for this SA Drought Hub podcast.
Thank you very much for hosting me, Drew, and all the very best to the growers throughout South Australia for a successful 2025 season.
And that concludes this podcast. You'll find more podcasts on the SA Drought Hub website at sadroughthub.com.au. The South Australian Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub is one of 8 hubs established across the nation through the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund. The SA Drought Hub is an exciting initiative which brings together a dynamic network of primary producers, industry groups, researchers, government agencies, universities, agribusinesses, farming systems groups, traditional owners and others to work towards a common vision to strengthen the drought resilience and preparedness of farms and regional communities in SA. Led by the University of Adelaide in partnership with the Department of Primary Industries and Regions South Australia, the Hub is responsible for driving the extension of existing knowledge and practices to build drought resilience in primary production systems. Any recommendations, suggestions or opinions contained in this publication do not necessarily represent the policy or views of the South Australian Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub, SA Drought Hub. No person should act on the basis of the contents of this publication without first obtaining specific, independent professional advice. The SA Drought Hub and contributors to this publication may identify products by proprietary or trade names to help readers identify particular types of products. The Hub does not endorse or recommend the products of any manufacturer referred to. Other products may perform as well as or better than those specifically referred to. The SA Drought Hub will not be liable for any loss, damage, cost or expense incurred or arising by reason of any person using or relying on the information in this publication.